Hello everybody, my name is Derek and I am a PhD student at the University of North Carolina at Greensboro. I'm interested in studying physical activity related behaviors, so that incorporates physical activity and sedentary behaviors. I'm also interested in some affect items, but I'm really interested in just physical activity related behaviors, including physical activity and of course sedentary behaviors. Like we talk about today, we know that not only, engaging in physical activity is good for us, but also engaging in large amounts of sedentary behavior can be bad for us, right? And so I'm really interested in trying to bridge that gap so that we can become healthier and happier throughout our lifespan, and I'm happy to be talking with you today. I will put my contact information up, and so if you have questions or other issues, please let me know. I'll be more than happy to address those with you and talk and kind of continue this dialogue outside of just this recorded lecture. So to jump in, and first we really want to cover what's sedentary behavior. And so sedentary behavior is often referred to as waking behavior in a sitting, lying, or reclined position where the energy expenditure is less than or equal to 1.5 METs. And so here a key piece is waking, right? So I get a question a lot with my students about sedentary behaviors, right? So this would be sitting, lying, or in a reclined position. And the key here is it has to be waking, so it does not include sleep time. Okay? And in terms of this, kind of really thinking about sedentary behaviors, it involves sitting at other low levels of physical activity. So to me, when I think about sedentary behaviors, I like to contextualize it in terms of the physical activity and sedentary behavior spectrum. And so if sedentary behaviors on this kind of light end of while waking, sitting, lying, or in a reclined position and engaging in less than 1.5 METs of energy expenditure, then light intensity physical activity is non-sedentary waking behavior that requires less than 3 METs. Some examples here would include walking at a slow or leisurely pace, cooking activities or light household chores. Perhaps standing would also be, it would be included in here as well. Then of course we have moderate intensity physical activity, that 3 to 6 MET range, and then vigorous physical activity, 6 or more METs. So those sedentary behaviors are really those low levels, sitting and lying or in a reclined position while awake, right? And less than 1.5 METs. We'll talk about what this means, but this sedentary behavior definition is really important for us, especially when we start thinking about the future in terms of sedentary behavior interventions, measures, and whatnot. But this definition is really important, especially when we start talking about more things related to sedentary behaviors. And so, relatedly, in terms of sedentary behaviors, I think about this little heat map here. And so this heat map is a nice way to conceptualize both sitting time and physical activity, because while they are separated and they do have different outcomes that we'll talk about here, it's important to think that they're not separated necessarily completely from other types of activity-related behaviors, like moderate to vigorous physical activity. So we can see here that as daily sitting time increases, that becomes more red, so less healthier, right? But at the very low end of sitting time, we know that it's still going to be in the red, perhaps more orangish and not as red as you were to have if you're all the way at the top of that daily sitting time along the y-axis. So sitting time, regardless of, kind of how much moderate to vigorous physical activity you are doing, that increase in sitting time has detrimental health impacts for us. And so those, that really kind of starts to contextualize the importance of looking at sedentary behaviors and the importance of viewing sedentary behaviors, studying sedentary behaviors, and really understanding them. So very low time spent sitting reduces but does not eliminate that risk of that moderate to vigorous physical activity. And really, given the high levels of sitting that we'll talk about and the low levels of physical activity in the population, most people would benefit from increasing both moderate to vigorous physical activity and reducing the time spent sitting. And so when we talk about this benefit and the related, health costs associated with it, to put this into a little bit more of a context, why we might be interested in sedentary behaviors as a health risk. Sedentary behaviors are linked with an increase in obesity, cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, all-cause mortality, and depression, right? So both mental and physical health detriments come from engaging in sedentary behaviors, while the physical health benefits like obesity, cancer, all-cause mortality are more studied. There are becoming more and more studies that are looking at the mental health side effects as well, the mental effects, right? And so these things can have or long-term consequences from our sitting behavior that we engage in every single day. And so while they are long-term causes, they're more distal instead of proximal, right? They are important and they do accumulate, so we do need to be conscious of them in terms of the health risk. So now that we know that sedentary behavior has all these increased health risks that are going to be maladaptive for us, right? How much is too much sedentary behavior? So interestingly enough, the Physical Activity Guidelines for Americans that came out in 2018, the second edition, does not prescribe a quantitative guide for sitting time. They don't recommend any time of recommended sitting time of sedentary behaviors, citing that there's insufficient literature to recommend a specific target time for adults or even use sedentary time. And so, taking this a step further, there's even insufficient literature to recommend the amount of time the amount of sedentary time that should be interrupted by physical activity. So bout length that we'll talk about here today. And so we're really not sure how much sedentary time is too much or can be maladaptive in lots of respects. We can definitely understand the rough amounts of time, right? We can start to measure that. And we can see that in one study at least, or one way of looking at it, that the total sitting time with different age breakdowns can be 5, 6, 7 hours at a time, right? We can see that adults age 20 to 64, right, across the years. So the first one starting in 2007, 2008, and this is NHANES data. So down here at the bottom, really, this age group have increased in their sedentary behavior, right? In fact, most groups have increased in their sedentary behavior across time, right? At least there's that trend. So we know that sedentary behavior is increasing. We know that we're spending multiple hours per day engaged in sedentary behavior. I have to be honest right now, I'm sitting, right now and going through this. Most students are sitting, right? And so we know that this accumulated time of sedentary behavior, sitting at a desk, at a table, in front of a computer on Zoom, or working on papers, reading and whatnot, right? We know that we're engaging in a lot. We're not sure of the recommendations in terms of what is an acceptable level, but we do know that sedentary behavior has those increased risks for obesity, cancer, diabetes, all-cause mortality, and on. And so, where are these sedentary behaviors and the trends headed, right? And you can kind of guess based off this, the last kind of slide that we showed and we talked about a little bit here, that they're only headed up, right? And so, interestingly enough, the prevalence of sitting and watching television or videos for at least 2 hours per day was high in 2015, 2016, ranging from 59 to 65% of our sedentary time. And the prevalence of computer use outside school or work for at least 1 hour increased from 2001 to 2016 from 43% to 56% for children, and increased of about 5% for adolescents, and almost by 20% for adults. So that's a huge increase in that time, in that span. We also know that total sitting time increased from 2007 to 2016 from 7 hours to 8.2 hours per day among adolescents, and from 5.5 to 6.4 hours per day among adults. Now this is definitely some of the kind of maybe lower end in terms of just adults. We know that older adults sit for on average about 9.5 hours per day. So there's that range, and there's that big kind of gap between adults and older adults. But we know that people are engaging in lots of sedentary behavior, right? And it's increased with the definitely with technology. I'm sure given the pandemic that would be even more so. So there'd be more sitting time, more time spent in front of a computer, in front of a TV, when we're unable to maybe go outside and socialize like we once were, or even go to a park like we once were, and there's some other risks that we need to be a little bit more cognizant of. But the trends are that it's only going to keep increasing. Right? Okay, so now that we kind of know these trends, right, what might be some ways that we can start to measure sedentary behaviors? And so there are several approaches to measuring sedentary behaviors, and we really want to start thinking about kind of the dimensions of the acronym SIT when we start thinking about ways in which we should be measuring sedentary behaviors. So first, the sedentary bout frequency. So this can be device-based or self-report sedentary behavior and sedentary breaks. So the time and how much we're engaging. Start thinking about the interruptions, so the sit to stand transitions or drop in activity counts below a certain threshold, so the interruptions. The total time spent in sedentary behavior, so simply summing up sedentary behavior bouts into the amount of time, hours, minutes, what have you. And the type of behavior engaged while sedentary. So this is going to be a little bit more reliant on self-report measures that we'll talk about. But again, what we're engaging in, like we talked about on the past few slides, right? Understanding those behaviors, whether we're watching TV in front of a computer, talk about work and occupation a little bit earlier as well. And so understanding some of the context of that sedentary behavior. So when we think about measuring sedentary behavior, we want to come back to this SIT acronym about the bout frequency, interruptions, total time, and type of behavior, and start to think a little bit more about how this might influence our measures and ultimately the outcomes of some of the interventions that we'll talk about as well. And so, thinking about measuring sedentary behaviors, we first want to talk about what are the device-based measures of sedentary behaviors. Some people might call this the objective measures, and I'm going to call them device-based measures because the label objective starts to imply that it's completely valid and that there's no human input, and we'll talk about that's not necessarily true. And so labeling these as device-based measures of sedentary behavior starts to get at one way of assessing sedentary behavior, but of course not by any means be the end-all be-all or the most valid way per se. And so here there's a couple different measures that come to mind fairly easily, and these are really going to be accelerometry with the actigraph as the watches listed below. You can also wear these on a hip or around your waist, and that's most common. I just couldn't find a really good picture of the monitor, but these are some of the actigraph monitors down below. And again, this is accelerometry. It's counts per minute, and it counts activity in 3 different planes. And so we can get a good understanding of what sedentary behavior might be based on these counts. So this lower threshold of counts would be more likely to be sedentary, although there are some issues and we'll talk about them. Another one would be inclination or posture classification devices, like the active PAL, seen with the one person wearing it on their thigh. It's mounted directly to the thigh. It's a really good measure of posture. It measures the amount of time that someone spends sitting, standing, and moving each day. So it does have an element of accelerometry in there. Right? But here, the biggest difference is that it can actually detect the posture based on the positioning. So if it's mounted to the thigh, when it's standing, it's going to be vertical like this. When sitting down, it's going to be horizontal to the ground. So it's going to show more of that sitting or lying time. Right? And then it can also get that moving a little bit just based on the acceleration from the monitor itself. So these are some of the device-based measures of sedentary behavior that are most common in the literature and most commonly used. Of course, they have benefits and cons to them. And so in terms of the pros and cons for device-based measures, one, in terms of the pros, it's time-stamped. We can get a recorded time, right? We can get a recorded time when that active PAL goes into a horizontal position where we can say that somebody's most likely lying or sitting. It can be time-stamped in terms of the time of day, so we know when somebody is engaging in sedentary behavior. We know how much sedentary behavior that they are engaging in. Pros, more valid, perhaps, right? And so we'll talk about self-report measures of sedentary behavior in a little bit. But in terms of being more valid, we can actually get perhaps a better amount of time, right? We can help to validate those a little bit more in terms of the amount of time that that active PAL is spent in a sitting position, as opposed to relying just on me to say how much time I'm sitting. Some of the cons here, then, a lot of times it uses proprietary software, meaning the company decides what is sitting and lying, and that's not left up to the researchers to decide. Conversely, we have to determine cut points. So cut points are the amount of counts per minute. This is especially important with the active graph, where we have to get the counts per minute and then say, okay, based on these counts, we're going to say that this person was sitting. So, for example, with the active graph, common cut points for sedentary behavior is less than 100 counts per minute. Right? But if we go back to the sedentary behavior definition, it's waking time while sitting, lying in a reclined position, perhaps. However, if somebody's standing and standing still, that might be less than 100 counts. And so it might be a little bit tough to tell without that inclination, like the active PAL, of what that person's actually doing. And so those cut points can be a little bit tricky. And that kind of leads me into that last or that third point. Is it actually capturing sedentary behavior? So, are they standing or are they sitting? With that active graph, it might not necessarily be clear. With the active PAL, it records time spent sitting or lying. Are they awake during that time? Are they asleep? Remember, sedentary behavior is waking time, and so that can be a little bit difficult as well. The table that I have here goes through a few different issues, at least in terms of error and device-based measures. It talks about hardware, firmware. It talks about some outcomes. It also talks about some sources of error here in terms of sampling, in terms of those proprietary algorithms that I talked about. Perhaps it's used for the wrong population or just maybe not as accurate as what we would like as researchers, kinesiologists. And it talks about some different stages of data aggregation. And so the point here being that there are pros and cons to device-based measures, and as kinesiologists, researchers, knowing those pros and cons can definitely help us make decisions about what sedentary behavior measure might be most helpful for us, especially when we start thinking about some of the future directions that we're going to go in today's lecture. So transitioning a little bit here then from device-based measures that are hardware and whatnot in terms of the active PAL or the active graph. Then talking about some of the self-report measures of sedentary behavior. And so one easy one would be these retrospective questionnaire measures. There's many of them. There's many more than are just listed here, right? One common one is this last one on here that as kinesiologists in the field, I'm sure we've seen at some point, the International Physical Activity Questionnaire, the IPAC, right? If we're looking at the IPAC short form, there's one question at the very end. It's question number 7. It asks about how much time you spent engaging in sedentary behaviors on weekdays in the last 7 days. So it's focused on just weekdays here. Other measures focus on both weekend and weekdays. Others make that distinction, as we know that there is differences between weekday sedentary time, especially for working adults that might spend a lot of time sitting at a desk for occupational reasons, compared to weekends. We might have those weekend warriors that engage in lots of physical activity on the weekends, but not during the week. So there are those distinctions in terms of those retrospective measures, and we'll talk about some of the pros and cons of those measures. Another form of self-report measures can be used with ecological momentary assessment, and so EMA for short. EMA is really built on the idea of capturing intensive longitudinal data, meaning repeatedly assessing individuals multiple times within and across days and asking them about their sitting behaviors, about their sedentary time. It can also be paired up with a device-based measure to look at that. And there are studies that have validated that when somebody says that they're sitting at a certain time, that they actually are. So to provide a little bit more context here, if you're not familiar with EMA, ecological momentary assessment, one of the most common ways to enact EMA is to ask people to respond to questionnaires on a mobile phone several times per day. I've been involved with studies that have ranged from 8 to 10 times per day. And throughout the day, people are asked these questions randomly throughout the day. And so they might be asked, were you sitting while doing that activity? With a yes or no. So trying to get a little bit more of a handle on people's sedentary behaviors. You respond yes or no. I'm sitting right now. I respond yes. So these questionnaires can be kind of quick, but really it's trying to capture people in the moment, in their real world, real life, real time events to gauge a better understanding if people are engaging in sedentary behaviors. So retrospective and EMA, both measures that are commonly used for self-reported measures of sedentary behavior. And so what are some of the pros and cons of self-reported sedentary behavior measurement? So in terms of retrospective measures like those questionnaires, the IPAC, for example, some of the pros, it's feasible for large sample studies, right? We can get lots of people, lots of data. That NHANES data graph that I showed a little bit, or table, that I showed earlier, using some self-report measures, some retrospective measures, asking about in the past. You can also record type and context, so where that person was, what they were doing, that those device-based measures might not be able to. Some of the cons, there's greater variation in validity of the different measures. So depending on what measure they're using, it can be really, really big variation in validity. Magnitudes of 10, so big. Another con is the time frame of assessment. Right, for that that International Physical Activity Questionnaire, the IPAC, it asks in the last 7 days, how much time did you spend sitting on a weekday? Right. So I don't know about you all, but I am certainly pretty bad at saying how much time that I sat for, if you're going to ask me on the top of my head. Right. In fact, we are probably better than most people because we might have this sedentary behavior, this physical activity-related behavior mindset when we're thinking about it a little bit more, right? So we'd probably be a little bit better, but I'd probably be a little bit off and not as accurate. Especially when those time frames get longer and longer, right? And there's also some social desirability here. I was working with a participant for a study that we asked them about their time that they spent sitting and asked about different activities and what they were doing while they were spent sitting. Okay? And they asked me a question and they kind of started to talk about how they've been quilting during the pandemic and how that they're quilting and when they quilt they have to sit, and so it's not them being lazy, but it's them being quilters and wanting to quilt. And so perhaps there's some social desirability here where people might be embarrassed about the amount of time they spend sitting or engaged in sedentary activities, and so they might start to maybe not remember as well, right? Or say, 6 hours a day sounds like a lot of time to sit. I don't do that. I don't sit a lot, so maybe it's 3. So there might be some social desirability there. In terms of EMA, some of the pros talked about, it captures us in real time, in real world sedentary behavior situations. Right? And so if you ask me from sitting, yes or no, right? Regardless of some social desirability, I'm probably more likely to say yes. Captures in real time. I don't have to think about it. I don't have to recall it. It's in the real world, so I'm doing it then and there, right? While I'm out and about answering questions on my mobile phone. We can record the type and context that's surrounding sedentary behaviors. So context, who I'm with, where I'm at physically, indoors, outdoors. Record the type, so what I'm doing, different modalities. If I'm using a computer, if I'm watching TV, if I'm driving in a car or riding in a car. Some of the cons for EMA, compliance. So in order for EMA, ecological momentary assessment, to work, people need to respond to those questionnaires that might be spread out throughout a day. So we have to have people respond. There are differences in compliance for sure, especially by age range, age group. Participant burden's another one. So if we're asking people multiple times to respond, are you sitting? And what activities are you doing? They might be burnt out. They might be really burdened and therefore not respond, reducing our compliance. And lastly, there's some reactivity here. So related to social desirability to a certain degree, perhaps people change their behaviors because they're being asked about their behaviors. So if I were to ask you every single day, multiple times per day, how much time you spent sitting, perhaps you'd start thinking about the amount of time that you spend sitting and therefore limit the time that you spend sitting because I'm asking you about that. So that's reactivity. There's some things we can do as researchers to help combat these cons and really kind of pit the pros so that they are more advantageous to use, both with self-report measures and device-based measures. So far we've talked about sedentary behaviors, we've defined it, we've talked about why it's bad for us, some of the health risks associated with sedentary behaviors. We talked about common measurement strategies, both device-based and self-report. We talked about pros and cons of both of those different types of measurements. And next, I would like to talk about some interventions, or how can we intervene on sedentary behaviors. And so, in terms of intervening, I think this first point here is going to be really key and has been cited by many different people. But we have to establish a public health message for reducing sedentary behaviors. And that would suggest to limit discretionary time to sitting maybe to no more than 2 hours per day, and to stand up and move after 30 minutes of uninterrupted sitting. And think about habit disruption or changes in the environment that may help to enhance our ability to limit the time that we spend sitting. So these are some suggestions that have some weight behind them, right? Have some evidence, and they each kind of hit on a couple different aspects. First, the top point, establish a public health message. In terms of talking about the amount of time that we should be sitting, we have to know, right? And we don't. The physical activity guidelines don't make that recommendation like we talked about, right? But we need to make sure when we know that message is consistent. That also relates to that second point in terms of kind of having a time frame where we can say more or less than and a time to shoot for. Because right now we don't. And that last point is talking about something that I've alluded to throughout this little lecture. That's talking about we might not know necessarily that our sitting behaviors are things that we do without consciously thinking about them. So, in terms of sitting, every morning when I get to my lab, to my workspace, I come in, turn the lights on, I walk over to my desk, I get my computer out, put my lunch in the fridge, and then I sit down. Right? I do all of that without thinking, and I sit down without thinking. Start working, start answering emails that I need to get to. Right? And so that's sitting, right? That sitting is habitual. That's something that I do without thinking. It's non-conscious, right? I do it without thinking. And so changing the environment may help to enhance the ability to kind of limit that sedentary behavior. Right? So thinking about sedentary behaviors in a little bit different way than perhaps just trying to limit a certain amount of time, but thinking about how that's ingrained in us, that becomes habitual. So one of the more heavily researched ways in terms of sedentary behavior interventions looks at self-monitoring. And so here, self-monitoring simply means that it's keeping a record of specified behavior as a method for changing the behavior, really developed by Michie and colleagues. And so here in this forest plot, where it's looking at interventions using self-monitoring to reduce total sedentary behavior time. And so here we see at the very bottom that larger diamond, that really this average effect size across all these studies, or the Hedges G, is significant, and it's above 0 towards closer to that 1 mark, which indicates that interventions using self-monitoring as a behavior change technique have the potential to reduce total sedentary time in adults. So it kind of goes back to that habitual piece, perhaps, or thinking a little bit more about kind of reactivity that I was talking about in terms of EMA. Thinking about our sedentary behaviors can start to have an influence on our actual sedentary behaviors, thinking a little bit more about them, disrupting some of our habits to be sedentary, perhaps can help change our sedentary behaviors, just like this meta-analysis and forest plot would suggest. So some other things to think about and how we can intervene on sedentary behaviors. So we can implement standing desks, which have been shown to be successful in reducing sedentary behaviors. So going back to that example, when I come into my lab space and I'm working, if I had a desk that was a standing desk, which I would love to have, but don't, then I might be less likely to come in and sit down immediately. In a classroom, same thing. Pre and hopefully post-pandemic, right? Coming into a classroom, having that standing desk, having a space to stand and to be comfortable doing so is going to help to reduce our sedentary time, and at least here has been shown to be successful in different interventions. However, few studies have analyzed the effect of breaking up sedentary behaviors, meaning giving breaks or helping to break up prolonged periods of sedentary time. And these findings have really been inconsistent, and at least more recently, there have been few studies that have really kind of looked at this. And so perhaps trying to break up the sedentary bouts, perhaps like the other slide suggestion from Owen, breaking up those kind of times in 30-minute bouts, getting up, moving around, engaging in light physical activity, perhaps that would help. However, the evidence for that is really inconsistent and not overall robust by any means. And so whenever I think about sedentary behavior interventions, I think about kind of perhaps pairing them with physical activity. And so perhaps combining sedentary and behaviors and physical activity interventions. If we think back to that heat map, we know that they can kind of be related, right? However, interestingly enough, interventions only targeting sedentary behavior have the largest impact on sedentary behaviors, and about a mean reduction of about 91 minutes per day, compared to interventions targeting both sedentary behavior and physical activity, which resulted in a mean reduction of 35 minutes of sedentary behavior per day, which I find to be very interesting. If you look and dig into this research a little bit more, perhaps there's a greater focus on physical activity because we know the recommended levels of physical activity in terms of that 150 minutes of MVPA mark, whereas sedentary behavior might become a little bit more ambiguous, meaning we might not have a great handle on that kind of time frame. And so when you start to split up and divide between physical activity and sedentary behavior, those kind of benchmarks may help to sway and kind of change physical activity behavior a little bit more than sedentary behavior. And we're never going to get away from completely being non-sedentary, right? We have to sit to do some things, eat, for example, perhaps, right? So we're never going to get rid of sedentary behaviors, but starting to reduce the amount of time is going to be helpful. And this research would really suggest that we need to not only have physical activity interventions to help increase the physical activity participation, but to focus on sedentary behaviors as a behavior that has significant health consequences, which it does, and help to look at interventions to help reduce that time as an individual behavior. And so really, if we were to summarize some of the interventions, I would say it's early stage. We have some ideas of what can be done to help people kind of intervene on their sedentary behaviors. We have a long way to go. We have lots of kind of unanswered questions. We have kind of maybe more of a hodgepodge of different ideas of how we can get there based off of standing desks, based off of kind of using that kind of health message, thinking about habits, habit disruption. And so really when we're thinking about kind of sedentary behaviors, thinking about what are the future directions for sedentary behavior research, there are a few things that come to mind. So first, standardizing the definition of sedentary behavior. Believe it or not, there's lots of differences within sedentary behavior. Right? And thinking about it in terms of that while awake, sitting or lying or in a reclined posture, right? And engaging in less than 1.5 METs. Right? Key here is waking time, right? And so starting to standardize that definition, which it has been, especially since the early 2010s, has really become a little bit more synonymous and established, but creating that and using that standardized definition for sedentary behavior is definitely a future direction that researchers and the field need to take. Next, you need to improve and kind of standardize the methods for assessing sedentary behaviors. So if they're using the current device-based measures, starting to improve and standardize those methods and use not only, for example, like I talked about with the actigraph, on that 100 counts per minute range, right, or below, would be sedentary behavior if you're using an actigraph monitor. So standardizing that kind of threshold, but also standardizing the procedures for data cleaning and reduction that we'll talk about here as well. So standardizing those and improving them to be more accurate, have greater validity. Develop and validate device-based measures of posture and intensity. So we talked about the active PAL measuring that inclination, whether somebody is standing or sitting or lying, and also measuring the intensity of the activity that they're engaging in, and to help get a better understanding is if they're actually engaging in sedentary behavior or perhaps light physical activity that would maybe be around the same, if if they were standing, for example, as opposed to sitting. So combining these postures and intensity of people's behaviors. Like I alluded to earlier, standardized data collection and reduction for accelerometry. So standardize those procedures across different interventions and different studies. That's going to be helpful for the field moving forward. Needing more longitudinal observations with device-based measures. So tracking people across time, perhaps that's using EMA, right? Intensively kind of tracking people, capturing their behaviors across time, perhaps even pairing that with device-based measures to get a better understanding of their sedentary time and their bouts, and also using EMA to understand who they're with, what they're doing, kind of gaining that extra contextual piece. So perhaps merging the two together in terms of longitudinal and device-based measures. Clarifying the dose-response relationship with those repeated measures. So understanding how much and when is going to be really important, especially when we're going to start to try to define the time limit for engaging in sedentary behaviors and what is considered to be healthy and what might be considered to be less healthy. And lastly here, investigate sedentary behavior in more diverse and at-risk populations. We know that racial and ethnic minorities can sit more often or engage in greater amounts of sedentary behaviors than their white or European American counterparts. We know that there's at-risk populations like older adults who sit on average for about 9.5 hours per day. And so looking at those populations and understanding the different factors that influence sedentary behaviors and developing targeted and specific interventions for those aging and at-risk populations. So these really kind of start to summarize the future directions for sedentary behavior research. That is all that I have for you all in this lecture. I really appreciate the opportunity to be speaking with you and to share some of my research interests related to sedentary behaviors. If you have questions, I'm more than happy to address them or answer them. Please reach out, let me know. If you're interested in these topics, I clearly am, and I would love to kind of have that dialogue with you. So, best of luck. I hope everything's going well in the pandemic. Remember to take a breath, stand up, move around, especially during sedentary behaviors for all the benefits, both health and mental benefits, and use some of this data, use some of this research and knowledge to help others do the same. Thanks so much.